I can do things at WED without asking anybody, even my
Coney
wife.
Island, world's biggest barrel of
And
fun.
anywhere else your imagination takes you.
Okay, we've done that now, Paul.
To get the whole show now, you hurry, hurry, hurry!
Anything's possible at Disneyland.
Welcome aboard the Themed Attraction Podcast, where we take you for a ride through the spectacular world of theme park design, that is. You've just set course for discovery and discussion with theme park industry masters of the craft. I'm your skipper, Freddy Martin, and gliding the Green River with me, as always, is theme park designer, master planner, and chief creative officer of Storyland Studios, Mel McGowan. What's in store for us today, Mel?
Well, Freddie, we're taking a bit of a different route through the jungle today. We're going to interview a friend of the show, Lou Prosperi. Now, Lou's not your typical guest, but I think our passengers will soon figure out why we asked him to join us. His day job has him developing curriculum for gaming and software companies, but his secret superpower is studying the work of theme park designers and breaking down the principles that guide great spatial design. Kind of like a systematic themology.
Well said. Lou's books explore core spatial design concepts like kinetics, force perspective, storytelling through environmental cues and things. And collectively, his books are titled the Imagineering Toolbox. All right, folks, keep your hands, arms, feet, and legs inside the boat, because this episode is about to leave the dock. Hit it, Sam. Okay, so Mel, this is going to seem a little bit random, but I think I remember the first time that I realized that people in positions of power or construction or whatever are actually designing some of the spaces where we live, where we work, where we play. So,
well, I don't know if the people in power are the ones actually doing the design, but,
yeah,
but that's another conversation.
Perhaps. So here's my story. When I think I was 5 or 6. And we lived in an apartment building or apartment complex, and I had these two little friends, Tony and Jerry, not Tom and Jerry. But it always helped me remember their names, Tony and Jerry. And we were running around playing hide and seek in the apartment complex, and there was this gate that we could reach and open up, and we could go into this gate, and inside were all of the power, all the gauges that. What are they called? The meters, the gas and the electrical meters were all hidden behind this little fence. And I remember sitting in there waiting to be found in hide and seek and realizing, wait, why aren't these out there? And clearly they've made a space for just these things to be hidden. And it was really kind of like realized, oh, you hide certain things. You put them behind certain things. And I recognized sort of a strategy for building homes, building places, is there's certain things that you want people to see, and there's certain things that you don't want people to see.
You know, it's funny because in our design work, particularly for things outside of theme parks, that concept of front and back and on stage and off stage is so foreign to the world that we live in. Like people don't know what the back of a building is, what the front is. Yeah. And it is a shame that that's not just a commonly understood thing. My kind of childhood recollection is pulling up to Disneyland for the first time that I recall. Was old enough to remember what was going on, and literally being disappointed because I'm pulling in. I just see this big parking lot. I'm like, where's the stuff?
Yeah.
Like, where is everything? Like, I think I was expecting that Wally World vista, when the family pulls in, and kind of like you still get at Six Flags Magic, where all the hardware is laid out for full display, from the freeway. But I'm just like, you see this one little Victorian train station, and that was about it. And
big empty parking lot.
The concept of an intentional reveal, was kind of had yet to be discovered by me at that stage.
Yeah. I recently went and listened to Imagineer Joe Rohde talk at the Getty Museum, and he began his talk about the history of art, the lineage of theme park design, tracing all the way back to the Romans, cathedrals, the Baroque masters, and things like that. And he was talking about how his team draws upon those things, those same principles they were using way back then, in the creation of modern lands like Pandora or Galaxy's Edge, things like that. And he began with the idea of surface, that you see the surface in Rome that was marble, but it was only a few inches deep of marble. The rest was all concrete. And that talk was so educational. We were sort of learning, and Joe was helping us to intentionally understand a sort of graduate school course in theming, and that it's not just limited to this new stuff that we do. It's been passed down through generations. So I wanted to ask you this opening question. Let's talk this out. In what ways do you see people in our industry, themed entertainment, utilizing this wisdom and techniques of centuries and then passing those down in the same sort of those same time-honored guiding principles, passing them on to the next group of artists?
Well, it's kind of interesting because I've always seen that direct parallel with ancient spatial storytelling, if you will, particularly as manifested in sacred space design. Because that's just an extremely obvious situation where you have some of the masters of the day, the master builders is the original definition of even the word architect, that really were responsible for this full holistic multi-sensory experiential design, inside, outside. They're designing the urban square out in front of the cathedral. They're designing that whole arrival sequence. They're basically translating stories to an illiterate crowd, and again, using the state-of-the-art technology of the day. If that's stained glass windows, that was pretty high tech back in the day. The IMAX of the day. And we've always drawn a parallel with that because we do actually sacred space work as well as current theme park work and entertainment destinations. And again, for us, that common thread of telling stories in three-dimensional space is timeless, and there's lessons that have long ago been forgotten by most modern and contemporary architects, because at some point in time there was this divorce of modern architecture from that idea of narrative, and they really adopted this mantra: form follows function. Whereas historically, with Michelangelo and the boys, form also followed fiction. Spaces always told stories, and again, those techniques of not being worried about the surface material being the same as the structural material. The idea that it's okay to have a veneer or a facade, that it kind of covers over the superstructure. To me, it's just remembering what collectively we lost, and we found that in some of our education work, particularly in architecture programs, that we almost have to de-architect folks that have been raised up in kind of a post narrative training, because we're finding that the world is very much hungry for narrative and story and connection.
Yeah. Well, our guest today is an educator and somebody who sort of deconstructs what the world is like, and then tries to communicate that back, just like Joe Rohde did, communicate it back to his audience. Education is supremely important, especially if we are going to pass those concepts and ideas down to the next ready generation of builders.
Well, we're in a unique kind of micro industry because we get so busy drinking out of a fire hydrant and we got our heads in this hole. That we're either trying to get the next project or just trying to finish the project that we're on. That quite often it's easy for example, for an entire generation to kind of retire out and to realize that, oh crap, we forgot to kind of raise up the next generation, to take that time out. We're so busy, it's hard to make margin, make time to train up that next generation. So personally, I've always been really passionate about that focus on intentional education, transfer of knowledge, trying to be accessible, create time. We've actually, a couple of us at Storyland have been blessed to be able to actually start kind of a new West Coast program out at a university called CBU. We've got a program called the College of Architecture, Visual Arts, and Design that we've really been able to kind of from the ground up kind of model some of our studios' multidisciplinary approach of in this program, accredited program now. You've got architecture, you've got urban design, you've got film, branding, communication, and one of our young architectural interns actually recently just finished his graduate degree and is now an adjunct professor there. And so we're really proud of Jacob. And I just can't encourage industry vets to follow some of our friends leads like Joe Rohde. To be able to do the level of education that guy puts out on Instagram, Tom Morris, on Twitter. These guys are taking time out of pretty busy schedules to again transfer that knowledge, and I personally have really appreciated those efforts.
That's great. Well, that's exactly what I think our guest today discovered when he began to sort of systematically deconstruct and organize what he sees as a pyramid of Imagineering, which eventually became the title of his first book. Tell us a little bit about Lou Prosperi and how we got to know him.
Well, ironically, I happen to have had his book in my overnight bag on the airplane. I just randomly, I don't know where, saw the title, picked it up. There really is a kind of a dearth of a lack of quality, kind of non-fan, kind of just coffee table, kind of, meat and potatoes kind of textbook type books on the industry. And I had come across one of his two books and happened to be reading that when Lou had actually reached out to me as just a fan of the podcast and an avid listener. And I thought, boy, that would be really great to just have this conversation.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's get started, shall we? Back to the Blue Sky Loft at Storyland Studios with our guest, Lou Prosperi.
Hey, Lou. Great to have you on board.
Hey, Mel. Hey, Freddy. Thanks so much for having me. I'm a little flattered and honored both to be joining you today.
Well, it's a unique thing for us today to have you on because as an author, a researcher, a developer of curriculum, et cetera, you're not necessarily the typical theme park industry master of the craft that we usually talk to, but you've spent so much time and research thinking about and diving into what it is that folks in the theme and entertainment industry do, that it just felt great to kind of get somebody in here who can look at from the outside and speak to exactly what it is that's going on and when people create really fantastic themed environments.
And I was just mentioning that I actually have one of your books in my overnight bag. I'm right in the middle of it. Before we even started talking about it, I've just been digging in. One of our things that I personally get to do, the privilege of doing, is for every one of our new hires at Storyland Studios is we get kind of a day with the founder, a day with the principal, and I kind of walk them through the spatial storytelling kind of crash course overview. And some of that is almost kind of de-architecting people that have been trained as architects, or, kind of helping them forget what they've learned through, grad school, and really just kind of helping them step into a different way of thinking. And I recognize that the outline that I use is basically your first two books. I mean, I go through kind of the new type of language and the power of words creating worlds and completely new paradigms. And then secondly, we go through the process. I'm a big believer that, kind of the process really creates our product, and that the journey really defines and is the destination. And so, like I said, we're speaking the same love language, and I love that you've so succinctly and accurately kind of been able to distill that for not only our industry, but I think more intentionally for those that are outside of the industry. So great work so far. Can't wait for book 3.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and thank you for those kind words. My goal, the original target audience was more people in any sort of field who are doing something creative, and I have a belief that there's a level of creativity in everything we do. But if the audience could also include the theme park industry, theme design industry, then sort of my cup runneth over. That's just extra. that's just a great extension of the target, I guess.
Well, we've got to start by talking about how we even kind of connected to get you on the show. It really started with you and I just connecting on social media about kind of our kind of shared nerddom for some trolley park, amusement park history, particularly. So tell us a little bit just about growing up in the shadow and in the wake of Pleasure Island up in the Northeast there.
Right. So I currently live in Wakefield, Massachusetts, which, as you mentioned, was home to Pleasure Island back in 60s, early 70s.
Yeah,
I think.
What the heck is Pleasure Island for those?
So Pleasure Island was one of the 3 parks.
Not Meriwether Pleasure's domain.
No, not that one.
No.
Nor Pinocchio's getaway.
Definitely not those. It was one of 3 parks that was built along with Freedom Land and.
There was Magic Mountain in Denver.
Magic Mountain might be the other. They were built by C.V. Wood and a couple of his partners. Now, C.V. Wood was a guy who worked on Disneyland who, not as well known as some. I think actually Todd Pierce's book, 3 Years in Wonderland, does a great job of talking about his contribution. But after he worked on Disneyland, he wanted to build other similar parks, and Pleasure Island was one of them in Wakefield. I did not grow up here, so I did not go, but my in-laws, I moved here because this is the town my wife is from. My in-laws went, and they remember it. And so, but one of the other, I don't have a whole lot of connection. I am friendly with a gentleman named Bob McLaughlin, who is the president and founder of Friends of Pleasure Island, and he does tours of the space where it is, and there's still some remnants of the park.
No
there.
Kidding.
Just a few, but
yeah.
But I think there's a pond where if the water level drops, you can see the skeleton of a pirate ship that was there once.
Wow. I thought you were going to say Moby Dick's remains are still there.
So and he does that, and so I have a couple books. But one of the other things that we talked about was Canopy Lake Park. I happened to see you post at one point about one of the few parks you hadn't been to, and I wondered if that, because I know you also like small parks. You're not just about the big giant stuff. And so I asked about Canopy Lake Park, which is just in Salem, New Hampshire, which is not too far away. It's a place we used to go every year. The last couple of years, it's slowed down as my kids get a little older.
Yeah, I love it. We had a project in Manchester, New Hampshire, and definitely was lucky enough to get to pull over and ride the Cannonball. And I mean, really, to me, it really is one of the pristine trolley parks. Left remain last man standing kind of thing.
It's really
Kennywood and Knoebels and stuff on my bucket list, but it was wonderful.
Yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot of those trolley parks left. And it actually, I don't know if you got there, but it's got a neat little dark ride called the Lost Mine or something. It's a little weird because it starts in this mine in New Hampshire and then you end up in an Egyptian tomb. So the storytelling is a little weird, but it's charming, and there's not, again, in these parks, there's not a lot of classic dark rides like that either. So
right.
It's
That's awesome.
To be able to,
we were also lucky
that.
enough to have a project that was actually on the bones of another CV Wood park, the one outside of Denver, that was known as Heritage Square, but originally it was Magic Mountain. And that park was really unique in that it had its kind of core spine of its entry complex, railroad station tunnels, Main Street that was called Centennial City originally, that was designed by Wade Rubottom, who was the art director for Main Street at Disneyland and who did this wonderful storybook style American Gothic kind of an update of Frontierland and Main Street, almost like a hybrid between the two of an opulent silver mining town. But I mean, the architecture was just wonderful. They had this dinner theater there, and just shut down, I think, last year. So whoever didn't get a chance to experience that before it shut down, it was actually run as kind of a family fun center for a lot of years. But the park was really stillborn. It really never operated as intended. But anyways, just a little aside there.
Yeah, so that's how you guys met. But the what's really fun is your books are really dive into what you've perceived as, through your research, as the process and the work that goes into Imagineering for Disney, but in a lot of ways, the development of attractions and parks and things, whether they're Disney or not. Tell me a little bit about how you came to write these books and get yourself so focused on sort of digging up the bones of so many of these attractions that we love.
Well, so it started with my first trip to Disney World in May of 1993 for my honeymoon. I was working as a game designer in the adventure game industry, where I was in charge of a pencil and paper role-playing game similar to Dungeons & Dragons.
My son would love to talk to you. He just dove into that world recently.
And so, I was in a, quote, creative field. But we went and, as I think I tell the story in one or both of the books, the day we went, it was a rainy Sunday in May. And back then, the parks weren't that crowded. We literally walked on everything in Future World at Epcot Center. And that was when it was Epcot Center still. So I think Horizons was still there. World of Motion was there. The original Imagination Pavilion. And with each attraction, my eyes sort of got bigger, each one. We started with Spaceship Earth and Universe of Energy, where the whole theater moves, right? And then Horizons, where you go through, and Wonders of Life, and then Horizons, where you go through, this history of technology, or the development of technology into the future. And then by the time we got to Journey to Imagination, this is the one that really spoke to me a lot. And particularly, I remember very specifically, it ties to one of your first guests, Tom Morris. I think he was part of the design team on this. There's a scene where the car goes through, your ride vehicle goes through a doorway, and the word avalanche or tumble is sort of sculpted out of rocks around the doorway. And it just struck me in such a powerful way, like, wow, this is creativity like I've never seen before. And so I started learning, and then a couple years later, that first Walt Disney Imagineering coffee table book came out. And I started getting into it and wondering, what can I learn? What can we learn from this that I can apply to game design and other things? Because I'm a big believer in, what I think Brian Collins, he's a former Imagineer, the term he uses is creative cross-pollination, right? This idea of taking ideas and principles from one field and applying them in another.
Yes.
And so I started studying this process and then had to, take a break because my son was born and my daughter was born. We were living in Chicago at the time, but then I discovered a whole new raft of books had been written. John Hench's book, Carol Marling's book, The Imagineering Way, that small little book of essays. And I started getting deeper into understand.
Great little starter glossary, by the way, for anyone.
Great little book. And it's, so I love that one and the Imagineering Workout. And I've always sort of thought of my books as sort of a spiritual successor to those, like the Imagineering Way and I hesitate to say that because I don't want to sound too full of myself or anything, but the Imagineering Way are essays about sort of creativity in general, how the Imagineers think, and a workout is some exercises to help you think that way. And then my books are what are specific things they do and how you can apply them to other fields. So,
well said.
So I started looking at this process and sort of breaking it down, and some of it was laid out in some of the books I'd had, but some of it wasn't. So I knew, Blue Sky and concept and design and construction, and I knew there was the use of models and some of those. And while I was reading and researching, I was reading Jason Searle's Pirates of the Caribbean, From the Magic Kingdom to the Movies. Came across this line about, Jason was quoting Randy Bright, who was quoting Blaine Gibson. So Jason was quoting from Inside Disneyland by Randy Bright, who was quoting Blaine Gibson about creating these readable faces.
It's like one of those Russian doll situations.
That's right.
The quote within the quote.
That's right. Well, I remember when I read Inside Disneyland, I'm like, that's where it came from. I was trying to put the pieces together. And so about creating this readable scene, and I realized I was working as a trainer and instructional designer and technical writer then, that this is what we do when we build training content. If we build a slide with a flow chart or a diagram to simplify a complex subject, that's the same thing. You know, the reason we quickly understand what's happening in the jail scene in Pirates is because it's designed to be readable. And so I then said, well, what are the other principles? Well, they're all about story. Oh, and they use weenies, and they talk about transitions, and they use forced perspective. So I started to go back through my library with an eye towards what are these principles that they use. And I eventually built a presentation. And eventually I think my first version was 12 principles, and then I added a couple more and came up with 15. And then as I looked at them, I realized 15 is a lot to just talk about in a straight line, if you will, like linearly just, there's that belief or that study or research that says people can remember 7 plus or minus 2 things. So I wanted a way to organize this. So I realized there were some foundational principles, and then some of them seemed to go together in terms of navigation or wayfinding. Some of them were purely about visual communication. Plussing, which is, what I call Walt's cardinal rule, was clearly at the top. So I played around and came up with this pyramid. And then I presented it at an instructional design conference. And then along the way, I'd still been thinking about the process. And then I had all along been thinking that it could make a good book, too, if I broadened it a little bit and maybe added some information about some other fields that I was familiar with. And then I got an email from Bob McLean at Theme Park Press who said, I saw your slides that I had posted that this would make a great book if you made it a little broader and added maybe game design to it. So he had the same sort of idea that I did. So we worked together he was the publisher. He's the publisher of both books. And originally the book was supposed to be one that was supposed to have the pyramid and the process. But as I was writing it, I realized it was going to be huge if I did that. Mm-hmm. To be able to devote the amount of space I really needed to the process part, I wasn't going to be able to do that. So I contacted him and said, hey, how about we split it out and do a second book? And he was on board with that.
So I love the kind of, to me, my nickname is almost like the paradigm in the process, because the first one is really, it is about the vocabulary, the glossary, the paradigm, the kind of the unique way of thinking. But when you're trying to do the elevator pitch to a fellow instructional designer or just kind of explaining kind of this approach and where you've kind of distilled it from, what's the why that you've found or the motivation for those in various industries to be willing to look outside of their standard operating procedure? Like, what's the added benefit that comes alongside?
Well, I believe that there are lessons all around us in other fields that we can leverage, so I used to listen to Tony Robbins, the motivational speaker, a lot. And I remember very clearly the line he was talking about, feeding your mind, and somehow, maybe learning how a helicopter works might help you run your business, just because you never know. There's principles that work there. And so, as I said, I'm sort of a big believer in reading beyond your field, right? I mean, if as an instructional designer or technical writer, all I do is ever read about those by people who do it, and all they write about is that I'm only going to get so much better. But if you keep doing the same thing and expect different results, there's a word for that. I believe we have to look outside sometimes for new tools and new ideas and new insights. And I think there's a creative aspect to most fields. There's certainly, people don't think of technical writing as a creative field, but it is. There's problems that we face that we have to solve, and we need, creative approaches to do that. And so if we're going to look for solutions to creative problems, my view is why not look at some of the best examples of creativity? And I think theme park design, again, typified by Imagineering, I tend to be, Disney focused, but I know that some of the work that other groups like yourselves do is obviously at the same sort of level and the same type of work. There are lessons there. And so why not go, if you're looking to be more creative, why don't you go to people who are being creative and dig underneath the surface and figure out why it works so well? Why does Cinderella Castle capture our attention the way it does? And why is it, there are times I think I could go to Magic Kingdom, sit on a bench and stare at it for hours and never be bored.
The bow tree, I think, is how the Buddha did it.
Yeah, it is a wonderful textbook. Well, the reason I was asking it is, definitely we have a fair amount of work in fields, even outside of themed entertainment, in areas as diverse as education and hospitality and healthcare and even commercial spaces. And one of the things I have to do, not just with our internal team members, but with potential clients, is kind of educate them on kind of the design differential, the return on investment of the special sauce, the experiential ROI,
sure, right.
And kind of walk them through kind of Maslow's hierarchy and just the idea that, like, look, you can get her done for good, fast, and cheap. You can be the Kmart blue light special, but in today's world, it's pretty. If you're a retailer, for example, it is pretty hard to compete with either Walmart as far as just being the biggest or the cheapest, or Amazon for convenience. And so you're going to have to really come up with something that's pretty compelling. And what we found is that experience that leads ultimately to things like purpose and transformation. And again, these are things that the price tag is a lot harder to set. It's not just about how good, fast, and cheap, how many billions served at McDonald's. That's not the way that a lot of consumers these days are making their purchase decisions. And
they're basing it on that experience and what it gives to them, their family, their friends, to be able to dive into that experience. And it's no longer a burger or a coffee; it's connection.
And what I appreciate about your books is that there's certain things you can learn how to on a YouTube video. I just popped one up yesterday to figure out how to grill a meat that I've never grilled on the backyard barbecue last night. But when it comes down to really blowing up the box and really launching the bar on certain paradigms, it does take a little bit more process, structure, and discipline. And that's what I think your books have done in terms of getting into some meat and potatoes of going beyond just a quick video. So I've got to ask you, of the 15 building blocks of the Imagineering pyramid, do you have a few that are just the real kind of ahas that just blew your mind, that were the kind of the early inspirations for the book, or
the hardest to chase down?
Yeah. So, readability was clearly right in the middle of that, and it's no mistake that readability is in the heart of the pyramid, right? Because that was one that got me thinking about it. Creative intent is definitely one. So, and that's one of the foundations for those, the listeners who can't see the pyramid. The bottom has 5 blocks, and creative intent being, the objective and why you're telling the story in the first place and why you're doing this, and keeping focus on that. That was a key one. Sometimes I think, you could almost write a book about purpose on its own, like in businesses. And this may even happen within your business, right? You do things sometimes because you've done them, not because they're still serving your purpose, right? Every so often we need to evaluate. I'm trying to think of some of the others. Long, medium, and close shots is one that is sort of near and dear to my heart as a communicator, right? Because I definitely believe in this inverted triangle of, you start with the broad, just like a paragraph. You start with your topic sentence, which is broad, and then you drill down into the details. And again, as a presenter and trainer, pre-shows and post-shows, speak to me because, it ties right into the adage of tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Right. So those are some of the ones in terms of that are hard to sort of communicate, particularly in the written medium. Kinetics is somewhat difficult to explain in words. Hidden Mickeys was a little challenging to talk about.
Tell me about that. I'm sure it's not just hidden Mickeys that you found. What's the principle behind that level of the pyramid?
So that Hidden Mickeys is about engaging and involving the audience and sort of pulling them into the experience a little bit. And it's an interesting one because I like them. They're fun, but at the same time, I understand the criticisms that I've heard from some designers and that they take you out of the experience, right? If, an Imagineer named Wyatt Winter I saw a creative morning talk that he did he was talking about a hospital that he worked on in Florida. And somebody asked him about Hidden Mickeys, and he said that he's not a fan of them because, in the Haunted Mansion, you're supposed to be in this Gothic mansion, and then, look at the Mickey on the table. That takes you out of the experience. But at the same time, it does pull you in. And because in my view, once you see a hidden Mickey, you never see it the same way twice. It changes your experience. Now, maybe it pulls you out of the story a little, but it still changes your experience of that scene. Mm-hmm. And so, once you sort of see it, you never see it the same way again. And so that's why, it sort of engages and involves you. And then, a similar principle or tool or technique that I like to that are what are referred to sometimes as five-legged goats. Yep, right. The more generic term is Easter egg, right?
Right. And that's it's almost like breaking the fourth wall. Between those five-legged goats, of course, are where you're really inspecting the brushstrokes of the artists rather than them doing sort of a Ferris Bueller look at the camera and go, aha. So I can definitely see the difference between those two that do engage the audience more. Even the five-legged goat, I'm inclined to believe that some of that's unintentional. Nobody was, I don't think Mary Blair was trying to get everybody's attention to that. But in the end, that's what ended up happening because people who love certain artists, they're willing to go deep and find where they communicated something even deeper than the initial look.
I'd be curious to hear your take on, assuming you've been to some non-Disney parks, whether it's Universal or even some of the regional parks, on parks that either intentionally or unintentionally, because of lack of budget or design expertise or what have you, that may or may not know the rules, but basically break with some of these principles. I'm thinking of something like transitions. If you're in the middle of Universal Florida, and you're looking across the lake or the lagoon there, and there's no attempt to hide some of the visual distinctions between lands. What's your take on the California Adventure, for example, when it first opened with some budget limitations? And kind of throwing the traditional textbook out the window and almost working as a piece of almost walk through environmental art, with that postcard entry. Any thoughts on what happens when you break the rules?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of a couple examples, not only Universal, but even Canterbury Lake Park, that small park in New Hampshire that's not too far.
Yeah, just traditional parks in general, right? That are
right. They can only, for instance, in Canterbury Lake, there is a sort of a land that has sort of a Western rustic theme to it, but it's right next to the Ferris wheel. And a water park on the other side. So there's certainly some, challenges with transitions and sightlines for sure. As you said, that one of the thoughts that I had was, I enjoy Universal Islands of Adventure. I think Hogsmeade is really cool. I think the Spider-Man ride is great. And even King Kong was really fun. but sometimes walking through the land, like through Cartoon Lagoon, I think it's called, the land where the cartoons are. And maybe because I've studied this a little more, I'm paying closer attention than a lot of the audience. But the fact that the theme of that land is the medium in which the stories were told, regardless of style or context or any of that, is very jarring when you see Betty Boop next to Beetle Bailey, right? It's
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's like walking through the Sunday Funnies. It's really very much a print media based theme, right?
I mean, it's still fun, and there's lots of fun stuff to do, but it's just, and I think they're just priorities are different within certain areas. Good. I think they definitely spend a lot of focus on it, right? So within Hogsmeade or within Diagon Alley, the Universal creative team clearly focused a lot of detail on making an immersive environment. But whether or not you maintain that when you go from there to Jurassic Park, well, that's maybe not as important, and maybe that's true, right?
Yeah, there's a set of priorities that each enterprise is going to follow, and we see that differently in each of the parks.
Well, and sometimes it's intentionally, again, part of the magic of, walking around, for example, a literal Hollywood backlot is being on a Western street, rounding the corner, and you're in the middle of New York City. And I mean, that is, and even some of the original charm of Disneyland was kind of in that, that you're in this tiki pavilion, now it's the Tropical Hideaway, but, again, same structure, same building as Victorian, the Jolly Holiday Bakery. And there's kind of a magic to that kind of crash intersection that, isn't necessarily the smooth psychological transition that is more typical of, sophisticated kind of Class A Disney parks, but sometimes they're intentional.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. So you talking about that reminds me of a sort of a distinction I've made since the first book. So my description of transition is as making sure that change is smooth and seamless. And, in the instructional design world, I liken that, or I associate that to figuring out the right sequence in which to teach somebody something. Because sometimes we have to teach things in an order different than they might do it in the real world. So depending on the circumstances and the subject matter, that order and sequence matters. And so I originally went with the smooth, but then I realized, and I'm writing the third book, and so I'm taking this up, and it's going to deal with the principles in the pyramid. Taking the time to sort of rethink maybe. So now my sort of definition of transition is making sure that change within an experience serves the story best, because sometimes a crash cut is what you want. Right. As opposed to smooth and seamless. And so it's a sort of a distinction I made, probably a month after the book was published. I started thinking, maybe I went too far with that. Now, I did talk about crash cuts in the book, but my sort of definition of transition was about smooth and seamless. So,
Yeah, that's great, because that's kind of what was making, the difference in my mind, the almost like Universal almost has their own language, right, versus Disney in some cases.
Right.
And there's different effects that you intend.
And certainly in some places, Disney has challenges that they haven't overcome entirely either. I mean, the transition from Mad Teacups to Tomorrowland that's a jump, no matter what you do about it, right?
That's right. They're butt up against each other, and do diesel race cars represent the best transition from those. I was a little upset with Mel a couple seconds ago when he brought up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because that was one of the first things that I saw in this is there's when you look at your pyramid, and for the listeners to kind of picture a 5-layer pyramid. With 5 on the bottom, 1 on the top. He's got Lou's got things like it all begins with story, and like you talked about, creative intent there at the bottom, and then it builds through the idea of transitions and weenies up to forced perspective as being important, and hidden Mickeys as he talked about, and then hitting the top with plussing. And I couldn't help but think, that there are certain things you absolutely must have. Maslow says it's, food, water, and shelter. And it strikes me as being very true to what you've got there. I mean, you're saying, look, if you're going to do this, do it well. Start with a story. Start with some kind of theming, but then as you progress up, you can add to that. The success builds as you add things like kinetics and hidden Mickeys, and then finally, now that you've got it perfected, now that you're sort of self-actualized as a excellent park, you can begin to add to it and plus up the experience so that it sort of has a eternal, long life beyond what you had built. What are your thoughts on that? Does that sync with what you were intending?
Well, it certainly wasn't by design, but as you went through it, I was pleasantly surprised to discover that I agree with you. And certainly parts of it were like, as you mentioned, the 5 blocks at the bottom are what I even call the foundations, right? So story, creative intent, attention to detail, theming, and then long, medium, and close shots, right? These are sort of, you can't really do this stuff without those pieces in place. And then we move up to navigation. How do we move the guests around? And then how do we communicate with them? And then how do we reinforce what they've seen? And then how do we make it better? So it certainly wasn't a conscious, deliberate parallel to that, but I can definitely see that now. And again, that's a nice surprise for me.
I'm going to read into anything people say and make it my own. You can add my name to the back of the book from now on if you like. No. Add Maslow. How do you tell a story when people listen with more than their ears? Stories change lives. They make us remember, but only when they are felt and not just heard. Storyland Studios builds the impossible. We turn big ideas into reality. We tell stories in 3 dimensions to stir the senses so you can walk into places you've only seen in your dreams, in real life and real time. Storyland's artists, architects, and artisans take stories out of the imagination and build tangible dreams that leave lasting impressions and memories that endure for years. What's your story? Storyland Studios is themed entertainment, destination, design, production, and fabrication. Connect with the team at Storyland Studios to get started building your impossible dream today. Visit StorylandStudios.com or call now, 800-218-1932. That's 800-218-1932. Storyland Studios, your big ideas' best ally.
Well, then moving on to your second book, again, a great summary of kind of the different process that we go through from kind of pre-design, prologue, all the way through what you call the epilogue. You might kind of just giving us the book report executive summary of that, and then we can dig into some of the specifics, because that was a great read as well. So the second book, The Imagineering Process, sort of looks at a distilled version, a very simplified, very distilled version of the design process that, in this case, the Imagineers use from, when they say, we need a new ride in Fantasyland, to opening Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, right, or, pick a land, whatever. And so this was an interesting challenge because, this process, as you well know far better than I do, it's very complicated and very involved. But I was trying to boil it down to, like 6 or 7 basic pieces that were more memorable or rememberable, if you remember, and so, and I knew from reading, Blue Sky was a big thing at Disney, and obviously all creative things, but, they talk about it a lot, and concept development, and then, design, or what's often called, now I can't remember the word. How embarrassing.
It's all right. We know what you mean by design.
Yeah, right. Well, right. And then into construction, and, along the way they use models of all kinds. And actually at one point models was a separate stage, And I sort of realized that it's a tool more than a stage. So it takes this process they use and distills it. And it sort of, I didn't worry about the project management aspect of it, or, land, like the move dirt around part of any new project, right? Which is usually months and months of moving dirt around.
Sub-phases of design, schematic design development, and then phases of construction as well.
Schematic is the word I couldn't find. That's right. Thank you. And obviously, that moving dirt around, a lot of times that's infrastructure and stuff that's going to be invisible in the long term anyway. So we start this just, for the purpose, to help the people who can't see what we're looking at. It starts with the prologue where we identify the needs and requirements and constraints. One of my favorite examples of that is the space that is now the now closed Stitch's Great Escape, right? Where it was Flight to the Moon, and then it was Mission to Mars, and then it was Extraterrestrial Encounter, and now it was Stitch's Great Escape. They recognized a new need every so often, like going to the moon is boring. We stopped doing it a few years ago. We need to change this. Ooh, maybe we'll go to Mars one day, so we'll make it a Mars ride. 10 plus years later, they realized it seems we're not going to go to Mars, so maybe we need to do something else. And along the way, they had to identify requirements and constraints. It needed to fit in Tomorrowland. The constraint was, we don't want to tear down this building because it's pretty key to the whole architecture of the land. And then they move it. So once they identify that, and again, I use prologue and epilogue sort of to bring a story side to it. They go into blue sky and brainstorming. And this is, a distinction that I learned in the opening of this book. I tell a story about going to lunch with an Imagineer where I thought I had this all figured out. And I asked him a question. The Imagineer was Jason Grant, and he was a concept designer. And in my head, I thought that meant he did concept development. I hadn't quite made the distinction that there's concept design and concept development. And so I said, so you work after Blue Sky? And he said, no, I'm Blue Sky. Mm-hmm. And a little moment of panic, like, oh my God, I really don't know what I'm talking about, do I? The little inner critic was cheering because he was right that I was wrong. So we go through Blue Sky and then into concept development and the way I sort of talk about it is in Blue Sky, you identify what you want to do with as much detail as necessary to go to the next step and to convince the people who asked you to do it in the first place that you're going in the right direction. Mm-hmm. And then concept development is, and the example I use is Expedition Everest, one of my favorite attractions down in Disney World. A runaway mine or train ride through the Himalayas where you encounter the Yeti is a cool concept. But you can't start laying cement and doing blueprints from that. You need to know a lot more. So then they go into concept development and do all that. And then we go into design or schematic where you know what you want to build, but now you have to figure out how are you going to do it. What are all the technical design, electrical, facility. Well, in the three main pieces: facility, ride, and show. And then once that's done, they go to construction. Along the way, they use the models. I'm not telling you anything you guys don't already know, of course. And then we go to the epilogue, right, which is they open it, and there's sometimes multiple different types of openings. They may soft opening or whatever. They evaluate how well did we do? Did we meet our needs? Did we violate our constraints? And then at least, and I assume other groups have the same thing. I know Imagineering calls it SQS, or show quality standards, where over time they make sure that it's still fulfilling the original creative intent and that it's still good show. Mm-hmm. So that's a little longer than an elevator pitch, but it sort of explains the process. Maybe I rambled a little too much.
I mean, you nailed it. Which is really what we do when beginning any project. I think I know that when Mel starts, I'm going to kind of wrap it right around to what we started with. When Mel takes new designers, architects, people on the Storyland Studios team through orientation week, he really does walk them through these steps. A little different phrasing, but it's essentially the same thing. This is what they need to know to be able to create really compelling places that people want to return to again and again and again.
And I think for us, one of the big differences, at least in the non-experienced industry and in a client perception that I'm always trying to blow up is the idea that this is supposed to be some kind of relay race. That that you would have the baton, for example, and you would pass it from a client, that has a perfect set of expectations and requirements, and that he could pass that baton to a perfect designer, and he's going to drop a perfect set of plans, and then the baton gets passed to the winner of the blind poker game, which is the contractor with the low bid, and that he's gonna his bid is somehow going to resemble the end price that the client or the developer ends up paying, and really that kind of thinking or that wrong thinking creates kind of this inherent adversarial relationship where, because the client wasn't perfect to begin with, and because the designer wasn't perfect, and with all the thousands of man hours that go into design, documentation, all the different disciplines, the opportunity for kind of errors and inconsistencies then result in essentially contractor change orders, and so the one thing that we're big proponents of and believers of, and that organizations like Disney and Universal that have been able to create these teams that are able to kind of form, storm, norm, and then finally perform together, and get into the trenches, is that you have kind of this motley crew and the different disciplines, kind of from blue sky phase all the way to building, and they're on the journey together, and they're able to kind of bring their brain damage, their expertise, their experience to the table, and help someone on the front end that might be this fun and wacky illustrator that has no concept of throughput or no concept of constructability or phasing. But, again, for those guys to be able to walk through the process and the journey together. Again, having continuity of some team members, even if it's 1% involvement at the blue sky phase, their involvement may gradually increase as you go through the process. But that's definitely one of the ways that we've seen that kind of gets projects, number one, built, and then helps them to succeed, as opposed to kind of the way that guys often think that things happen.
Right. Well, one of the thoughts that came to my mind when you were saying that was one of the other things that. So I go through each of these sections, each of these steps in fair amount of detail, but then I also try to point out that it's not as cut and dry as this. That just because, like you said, you passing the baton was the part that triggered me, right? Just because you're, quote, done with concept development, you move into design or schematic, doesn't mean that you're done with concept development necessarily. You may have to go back. And so it's iterative, right? So there may be, a full image of this or diagram of this process may have reverse arrows going from every block to every other one, just because you may have to. Now, obviously, you want to minimize it for cost purposes and efficiency, but it's bound to happen. The other piece is that not every block is going to be the same size, and not every time. There's probably projects where you don't need that big a distinction between your blue sky and your concept development. If it's a simple enough thing, you may be able to do that all as part of one. Or your concept development, particularly in fields outside of theme park design, your concept development may be detailed enough that you don't need further design. So I try to show different models of how the process might work in different context. Sometimes blue sky may take a week, sometimes it may take a year, right? And so the process isn't quite as cut and dry as it looks. There's a lot more flexibility and adaptability to it.
Yeah, another aha for me is the idea that it's not like one phase is more important than the next, or that the team members involved with one phase are more important for the next. And that's really important. I mean, I think especially for anyone interested in getting into the industry, or for fans out there, a lot of times we love kind of almost glorifying, folks that can draw really well, people that are great at articulating a creative concept. But I'm just flashing back to working with Chris Tyler, who is the either the VP or president. I think she's the VP of Disneyland right now. But I was working with her when she was either an intern or just pretty fresh out of college as a young industrial engineer at Disneyland, and we were working through some of the prologue needs requirements, space programming, stuff for the Disneyland Resort expansion back in, 1999. I mean, a really long time ago. And again, that stuff makes or breaks you. Yeah. And again, obviously it was important enough to where, for her, it ended up triggering her ability to kind of come up with solutions like FastPass and to where now she's really kind of the owner calling some decisions in terms of, I'll take this new land or new ride or, this hourly capacity. I mean, and so it's, again, every phase of the process is so important, and it's not just the folks that get to cut the ribbon at the end of the day or the folks that, get marched out for press releases and fan events. Just
really
again, valuing the contributions of all the different disciplines is huge.
You really see a tapestry of talents and disciplines and no one step is done by one person. I think you kind of tend to see that when you take a big step back and look at the process. Well, Lou, it's been a blast. Really appreciate the time you took with us to share with us more about your book. And, you took a whole lot of your life time and experience, your career path, and you poured it into researching this really, really fascinating subject. And I know a lot of people would be and would really gain a bunch of knowledge and abilities by digging into your books themselves. So we really appreciate you. Thank you for sharing it with us. And we hope to have you come back again. What do you think?
You're very welcome first, and absolutely, I'd be welcome to come back.
Awesome.
So, if you don't mind,
sure.
I have just a reaction to what you were talking about right before you started to wrap up.
Zip. I'm unwrapping up. Okay.
Okay. Well,
wide open.
It's just one of the sort of aha moments that I sort of got, and it's a big one in the second book was. And it shouldn't be such a surprise, but how interrelated things are and how much bigger and more complicated this is than a lot of us think. A lot of us fans, there are people who read all the Imagineering books and understand it. And I'm not saying that I have that much more insight than them. But the idea of the interaction between design, at the large scale, and operations, just thinking about the impact of operations, is something that, we just think, they just build a roller coaster and it's going to have, but you have to think about capacity.
That's right.
How are you going to build the queue so that you can absorb the capacity that you want, and all those
Safety
things. Safety
standards, health standards, all that.
Marketability, financial return.
all that stuff that we, as theme park fans, we don't necessarily think about, and how just, a simple little example of how interrelated some of this stuff is that we wouldn't think about. Mickey's PhilharMagic, right, at Magic Kingdom, when designing and redesigning the theater, they had to lay in a whole bunch of new plumbing and electrical to support the special effects, right?
Yeah.
Who would have thought that you'd need to lie plumbing and piping underneath the whole theater and underneath every seat, right? So it's so much bigger and more, like I said, interconnected and interdependent than I think a lot of theme park fans even consider or think about. It's a fascinating, and that's why there's no end of it study to this, just understanding how it all fits together.
Well, what I appreciate about your books and your work is it's so concise and succinct. And a few years ago, a couple of us in the Themed Entertainment Association had put together kind of a document trying to almost for clients, but also for ourselves to kind of just capture kind of the process. And it's definitely a lot thicker, convoluted. That white paper is still available at tiaconnect.org under the resources. And the attempt was to try to kind of wrap our arms around the way that not only Disney had done things, but the way that things are happening currently in the industry. And the reality is they're happening lots of different ways by lots of different firms. But to try to kind of establish kind of somewhat of a protocol or almost a standard operating procedure, SOP, if you will. But definitely I think of that as a nice addendum appendix to your books, even though the intent is different, outside the industry.
I don't know if this is the specific document that you're talking about, but I actually have a screenshot of the TEA project design guideline, a little flow chart, right? To illustrate exactly how distilled this process is, because, I go through the overview and basically my question is it really that simple? No. It's really not that simple. But at the same time, if that process has, more little milestones than I care to count, and 7 tracks and 5 phases, it's interesting. I've read that. If it's that same document, I have read that document because it's a little dry, I have to admit, but it definitely helps you understand how.
Well, you want dry. Again, just yesterday we presented a critical path schedule from Dream Dedication Day for an entire new theme park, a 5-year schedule. And you want to go through a dry Gantt chart with a lot of milestones. But at the end of the day, to realize to the client, to the developer, this isn't dry at all. They're focused like an arrow to a bullseye on opening day, on budget, scope, schedule, and it is that simple. Like, when does the money start flowing, and when do guests start experiencing this? And so again, that can be something as thrilling or as
mundane,
as mundane as you want it to be, based on how much skin you've got in the game. But anyways, again, thank you so much. I'm really excited about your third book, and I'm thinking we've got to do it in park. We've got to do an actual, because it's all about kind of walking through and applying the case story. So we'll have to do it. Either
what are you doing in November? You going to be at IAPA? Well, go ahead.
I was going to say, no, I would love to go to a show or trade show or those events. It's hard to justify to my boss in the current job that I'm in.
That's right. Look, I'm going to go play for a week. Oh, we know for sure it's not a lot of play, and try to fit the play in.
We'll figure it out.
Right. Hey, for all the listeners, you can go back about 5 minutes for my wrap up. We had just enjoyed a lot of time with Lou Prosperi, and we look forward to doing it again. Thanks, Lou.
Thank you. You're welcome. Have a great day.
Mel, I don't know about you, but Lou's outsider perspective from the industry, not being within this industry, not working within this industry, I think it's refreshing because he gets to get a fresh take on what it is that everybody's doing here, and it kind of helps us discover things we didn't actually know about ourselves.
Yeah, it's kind of unique, even geographically, him being in the Northeast U.S., kind of out of the ecosystem of where a lot of the stuff is happening in Orlando and L.A. And also, I think the second aspect of having a kind of a pretty specific strategy of taking these learnings from one industry and being able to apply some of the language in the others. I mean, when you're in it, when you're in the trenches, you're working for different companies, different teams. Even at Disney, they're always really updating processes and changing. There really aren't the rules set in stone. But I think again, Lou's perspective was really just helpful, kind of taking a holistic overview, looking at kind of the sources he was able and kind of synthesizing that and also simplifying it in a way that's applicable. So just what a great primer to not just our industry, but again, taking those lessons and brain damage incurred and being able to share that into creative insights for other industries.
Yeah, that's very cool. It's great to have Lou on the show. Well, I see that the river is slowly bending up ahead, Mel. What say we make for home?
Dole Whips at Tropical Hideaway sound pretty good right now.
Oh my goodness, I'm in. Until next time, thanks, Mel. The Themed Attraction Podcast is hosted by Freddy Martin and Mel McGowan. We're really grateful you take the time to listen to your show, whether it's on your commute or in your exercise time, your jogging, your mountain climbing, whatever it is you do. Because of you, we're able to do what we do, and we can't thank you enough. Would you do us one more favor? Would you leave us a positive review on iTunes podcasts? You know, that really helps us get the word out. A lot of more people will find the show if you will just leave a couple words. 5 stars would be great. Share the show with a lot more of your friends. We'd really, really appreciate it. We also want to thank our guest, Lou Prosperi. Follow Lou on Instagram and Twitter at Lou Prosperi. And pick up a copy of Lou's latest books at imagineeringtoolbox.wordpress.com. Get access to more stories and interviews at themedattraction.com, an insider's look at theme park design by theme park designers. Follow the action on Instagram and Twitter at Themed Attraction. Connect with Mel by email via mel@storylandstudios.com or follow him on Twitter at Mel McGowan and Instagram at Visioneer. You can find me at freddymartin.net and follow my adventures at Skipper Freddy on Instagram and Twitter. Our theme music was composed by Rob Watson, other music provided by The Lost Dogs. This episode was designed and produced by the one and only Dr. Barry Hill. Find him at barryrhill.com. You know, Mel, as much as I like Barry, he's never been a big fan of our little jungle boat here. He thinks it's beneath him. Thanks for listening, folks.